200,000 Gauls roar like a storm in a stone enclosure, and on the hill are 60,000 Romans, exhausted, wounded, with empty stomachs. Already 2 months without bread, without wine, without hope. And yet it is they who will prevail. How? How can one withstand a force 4 times superior to you when every day is not a battle but survival? The answer to this question begins here, at the walls of Alesia. Autumn 52 BC. Gaius Julius Caesar surrounds the forces of Vercingetorix, chief of the Arverni, in the fortress of Alesia. Caesar himself wrote that 250,000 Gauls stood against him. They were like the sea, noisy, alive, untamable. But Rome did not retreat. The legionaries dug the earth, built fortifications, and strengthened their belief in one thing. If discipline falls, everything falls. The Romans erected a ring of walls around the city, not 1, but 2. The outer against the relief forces, the inner against the besieged. This hell of earthly proportions was called circumvallation. Imagine 2 lines, almost 20 kilometers long each, strewn with ditches, traps, sharpened stakes. These are not just fortifications, these are the stone bones of the empire. Such a double frontier required superhuman efforts. Each legionary carried over 40 kilograms of equipment: sword, spear, armor, food, tools. They did not just fight, they built their own prison, to die or win in it. In the Roman army, such soldiers were called milites, warriors whose bodies belonged to discipline. Soon supplies ran out. Archaeological findings show that there are no traces of large livestock bones at the campsites near Alesia. Caesar forbade killing pack animals. Without them, the legions could not move. They ate roots, chestnuts, even grass. Hunger became their constant companion. But despite this, no one abandoned their post. The Gauls, trapped inside, suffered no less. Their grain ran out, and their allies still did not come. Vercingetorix drove women and children outside the walls. He hoped that the Romans would let them pass, but Caesar did not allow it. Between the walls stood hundreds of dying people, those rejected by both friend and foe. The legionaries heard these moans at night, but no one moved from their position. Thus acted fear and duty simultaneously, 2 Roman deities without temples. When a person stands before a dying child and does not help, that is no longer just a soldier. That is part of a machine, created for victory. And yet the question hung in the air: what would happen when the Gallic forces arrived? After all, there were too many of them. Every day scouts reported, dust on the horizon, thousands of spears, the sound of drums. Hungry, tired, surrounded, the Romans knew soon everything would be decided. But they did not waver, because behind them stood not just an army, Rome itself stood. Thus began the siege of Alesia, a battle where the fate of all Gaul was decided, and where human will proved stronger than steel and stone. A cold morning. Damp fog crept through the Roman camps, the smell of rotting meat mingled with smoke from campfires. The legionaries' hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. For 2 months of the siege, they were given only a handful of wheat per day. Meat was a rarity, wine a memory. But even in this hell, order remained sacred. Every dawn began the same way: formation, weapon inspection, guard assignments. This was not how people survived, this was how Romans survived. Caesar understood victory here was not in swords, but in the ability to endure. He wrote that discipline was a chain binding the army stronger than steel. For the slightest infraction, death. One legionary who fell asleep at his post was executed before the ranks. This was called fustigation, a ritual beating that ended in death. Punishment, not for fear, but for balance, for if one falters, the legion falters. In those days, every movement was a ritual: digging a ditch, setting stakes, checking ballistas. The metallic hum of tools became the music of their survival. These machines, enormous crossbows on wheels, could pierce a man through at 100 meters. They were called Scorpio, and when their bowstrings were drawn, they sounded like the screech of a predator before a pounce. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix prepared for his last chance. He sent messengers to allied tribes, the Arverni, Aedui, Senones. Hundreds of chiefs responded. According to ancient authors, their army numbered about 250,000 men. This was a wave, surging onto the hill where 60,000 Romans stood. The ratio was 4-1. Even the most level-headed centurion understood. If this ring was breached, they would all be swept away. A centurion was not just a commander of 100. He was the embodiment of order, the nerve of the army. They knew their soldiers by name, shared their rations and their deaths. One such centurion, according to Caesar, held his position during the assault when everyone around him fell. He died standing, with his shield raised, like a statue of loyalty. Every day in the camp, signals sounded, short blasts from horns and trumpets. These signals were called tuba. By them, the legionaries knew when to start digging, when to eat, when to prepare for an attack. In the chaos of war, the sound of the tuba was like the voice of reason. Archaeologists found fragments of bronze horns in the vicinity of Alesia, traces of the Roman system where order was a weapon. But order does not fill the stomach. At night, legionaries dropped grains of wheat into boiling water and drank the cloudy broth. They called it pulse, a simple porridge that gave its name to the word pulsate. They ate it in silence. Only the crackling of campfires and the quiet clinking of metal broke the stillness. People slowly transformed into a mechanism, where each part was a person, and each person was a cog in Caesar's will. Hunger weakened bodies, but not spirits. One legate, Caesar's assistant, recorded that soldiers asked not for food, but for battle. They believed that suffering was the path to immortality. In their world, honor was worth more than bread. Caesar knew this and maintained the tension, like a blacksmith holding iron in the fire. He waited. He wanted the enemy to strike first, and the enemy struck. First, the roar of horns echoed from afar. The Gauls were advancing. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Dust obscured the sun. On the horizon, thousands of shields, spears, standards. The Romans lined up at the ditches in complete silence. Their formation was called testudo, the tortoise. Shields locked together, forming a solid vault of bronze and wood. Arrows, spears, stones flew over them, and yet they stood. Archaeologists found arrowheads in the layers of earth at the site of this battle. Traces of burns show that the Gauls set fire to the barricades, but the Romans extinguished the fire with their own cloaks, not retreating a single step. This was not just a battle, it was a test of the idea of Rome, that a man bound by discipline is stronger than any chaos. The battle continued for hours. Vercingetorix watched from the fortress walls, hoping to see the Roman line collapse. But it did not collapse. Caesar, standing on the hill in a scarlet cloak, raised his hand. It was a signal, and from the rear, fresh cohorts moved forward. 10,000 men, the empire's last hope. At the moment when the earth trembled under the enemy's steps, the Roman tortoise moved forward, slowly, inexorably, like a rolling stone of fate. And even those who were dying of hunger marched, not thinking of food, not thinking of life. Because now it was not about victory, but about whether a man could conquer himself. The din of battle did not cease day or night. Alesia turned into a living inferno. From the city walls to the outer ring of fortifications, the air was saturated with smoke, sweat, and blood. The Romans standing in the front ranks no longer smelled death, they simply lived within it. Sometimes at dawn, a low haze hung over the camp, a mixture of smoke from campfires and dust from thousands of footsteps. And yet order was maintained, as if the very ground beneath their feet obeyed Caesar's will. He did not leave the command hill. From here, Caesar saw both sides, the besieged Gauls inside and the vast army outside. It was a chessboard the size of an entire valley, only instead of pieces, living people. Historians note, no commander of antiquity held a position surrounded by the enemy on both sides. This was not a battle. It was an examination for the entire Roman system. At dawn, the Gauls launched a powerful attack on the northern sector of the fortifications, where the ground was uneven, where the ditch was shallower. Their goal was to breach the ring, link up with the Alesia garrison, and overwhelm the Romans by sheer numbers. Gallic warriors advanced in a wave. Their shouts filled the air like thunder before a storm. Shields covered with hides rattled in time with their steps. The Romans met them calmly. Veterans stood in the first rank. Grey-haired, scarred, they held pila, heavy throwing spears over 2 meters long. When the distance closed, the pila flew. Their tips, specially made of soft iron, bent upon impact and became lodged in the enemy's shields. A shield with such a spear became useless. It had to be discarded. This technique was called the deforming strike and became a symbol of Rome's engineering genius. But there were too many Gauls. They crossed the ditch, began to climb the ramparts. Roman centurions shouted over the din, giving commands. One of them, according to Caesar's records, tore off his helmet so the soldiers could see his face and led a counterattack. A cohort moved after him. A cohort, about 500 men, bound by oath. They fought as a single body and their blows sounded like hammer strikes on an anvil. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix ordered his men to sally forth onto the walls and attack from the rear. For the Romans, this meant the end. Between the two rings of walls, only a few hundred meters. On one side, the fury of hungry defenders, on the other, the onslaught of a vast army. Historians dispute how long this struggle lasted. Some say several hours, others an entire day. But one thing is clear, it was the moment when Rome stood on the brink of destruction. Caesar noticed that the Gauls were pressing on one sector, near the hill where Legate Labienus commanded. He sent cavalry there. Only a few thousand horsemen, but these were hardened veterans. Rome's cavalry acted like a blade. It outflanked the enemy, struck from the flank, and cut through the Gallic ranks. This maneuver in ancient Roman tactics was called outflanking from the rear, the Latin word circumvenire. It was this that later gave rise to the modern word surround. When the cavalry struck, the Gallic formation wavered. They had not expected an attack from the flank. Panic spread like a wave. Warriors, pressed between the Romans and the ramparts, began to crush each other. Caesar described the shouts as becoming so loud that the tuba signals could not be heard. The ground beneath their feet turned into mud mixed with blood. But the Romans did not stop. They did not know how to stop. Archaeologists found charred remnants of arrows, spearheads, and bronze belt buckles of legionaries precisely in this spot. Everything indicates that the fighting was close quarters, almost hand to hand. Soldiers fought not for territory, but for breath. One step back meant death. As the sun began to set, Caesar himself descended into the valley. His scarlet cloak was visible everywhere. This was an ancient sign, the commander himself in battle. For the Romans, this meant now there could be no retreat. Soldiers, exhausted, scratched, raised their shields and advanced. Vercingetorix saw this from the tower. He understood that the battle was losing its meaning. As darkness fell, the sounds of battle subsided. Silence hung over the field, broken only by the moans of the wounded. Caesar ordered not to pursue the fleeing. Bodies lay everywhere. According to ancient chroniclers, that night the legionaries did not celebrate. They simply sat by the campfires, feeling neither joy nor pride, only weariness and emptiness. But in this silence, something was born that would later be called Roman steadfastness, the ability to stand until the end, even when all is lost. However, Alesia had not yet fallen. Inside the fortress remained tens of thousands of hungry, desperate warriors, and now everything depended on one decision by Vercingetorix, one that would determine not only his fate, but the fate of all Gaul. The night after the battle hung over Alesia like a stone. No shouts, no songs, no clank of weapons. Only a dry wind smelling of ash and blood. Legionaries sat by campfires, wrapping their feet in cloaks, warming their hands over the embers. Their faces were grey, like ash. In 2 months of siege, they had lost almost everything: friends, strength, sleep, but not order. Even in the silence, the steps of the sentries could be heard. Tired but unwavering, they stood at their posts, because Caesar's order sounded clearer than any fear. He who endures is immortal. At dawn, news reached the Roman camp. Vercingetorix's army had vanished. The remnants of the army, realizing the assault had failed, retreated into the mountains. The din of war subsided, but Caesar was not in a hurry to celebrate. Inside Alesia remained tens of thousands of besieged, without food, without hope. Hunger now became their main enemy. According to ancient authors, the siege lasted several more days. The Gauls attempted sorties to get water, attacked posts, but their strength was failing. Women and children had long since died of exhaustion. Dead horses lay in the streets of the fortress. The stench was unbearable. People ate roots, leather, boiled straps from saddles. Even the stones of the walls seemed softer than their fate. Caesar knew that time was on his side. He forbade his men from approaching the walls. No attacks, no signals. Silence became his weapon. Every day the Gauls watched as the Romans calmly repaired fortifications, built new towers, sharpened swords. This was a psychological siege, not of bodies, but of will, and the will of the Romans proved stronger. The legionaries, despite their exhaustion, continued to build. They reinforced the inner rampart, installed catapults and ballistas. These enormous machines hurled stones weighing up to 30 kilograms. They were called onager, wild ass. When a stone was launched, the sound resembled the roar of a beast. Historians believe that this sound became a symbol of hopelessness for the besieged. Every hurled boulder reminded them Caesar was still waiting. At the same time, the Romans suffered no less. Food ran out. They ate the leather of their shields, boiled grain in swamp water. Archaeological studies show that bones of small animals, rats, foxes, even crows, were found at the campsites. This is not a myth. These are traces of real hunger, endured with iron discipline. During these days, Caesar wrote in his commentaries that the soldiers maintained a steadfastness worthy of the gods. He walked the fortifications on foot, greeted legionaries by name, shared bread with them, the very bread that was almost gone. In their eyes, he was not just a commander, but the embodiment of Rome, a state where strength lay in order, not in numbers. Vercingetorix, seeing the demise of his people, gathered a council of chiefs. According to various sources, about 80,000 people remained in Alesia then. Most of them were exhausted, unarmed. The chief understood there would be no breakthrough. His allies had left, provisions had vanished, the walls no longer protected. He knew that if the battle continued, everyone would perish. And then he made a decision that made him a symbol not of defeat, but of pride. In the morning, when the fog still obscured the valley, the gates of Alesia opened. A procession emerged from them. At the forefront walked Vercingetorix, tall, with flowing hair, in battle armor, with a golden torque around his neck. Behind him, warriors, carrying weapons in their hands. Caesar stood on a raised platform surrounded by his legates. The silence was almost sacred. Vercingetorix approached Caesar, cast his weapons at his feet, and knelt. This gesture became one of the most famous in history. Plutarch wrote that the Romans watched the scene without shouts or applause, only a resonant silence. Because before them stood not a defeated enemy, but a man who dared to challenge an empire. On that day, Alesia fell. From the city emerged the remnants of the garrison, women and children. The Romans divided them. Some were sold into slavery, others taken as captives. Vercingetorix himself was sent to Rome, where 6 years later he would be led in chains during Caesar's triumph and then executed. But his name would remain a symbol of resistance. For the Romans, Alesia became a lesson repeated for centuries. In the military schools of the later empire, it was studied as an example of total defense. The term circumvallation, first applied by Caesar here, entered the military lexicon of all subsequent eras. Even modern engineers, examining the remnants of the ramparts, are astonished by the precision of the layout. Every ditch, every tower, is measured as if built not by humans, but by a machine. And yet this victory came at a terrible price. Of the 60,000 legionaries, thousands died from exhaustion, disease and wounds. But their enduring silence became louder than any fanfare. Alesia proved an empire begins not with walls, but with the will of people who are ready to die, but not to retreat. After the fall of Alesia, the air around the city became heavier than lead. Even victory smelled of death. Bodies lay on the slopes, of people, horses, allies, enemies. The earth was so deeply saturated with blood that archaeologists 2 millennia later still find traces of iron and bones here. Caesar ordered the fallen legionaries to be buried with military honors, the Gauls simply to be burned. For him, this was not cruelty but order. The victory had to be clean. While the flames consumed the remains, Roman engineers dismantled the fortifications. 7 weeks of continuous siege left behind a system of ditches and ramparts over 20 kilometers long. In places where hoofprints were preserved, it is visible, every line of fortifications was built with jeweler's precision. Modern archaeologists call this a miracle of engineering without blueprints. But for the legionaries, this miracle cost lives. Hunger, disease, exhaustion, these were the true killers at Alesia. Many Romans died not from swords, but from dysentery and depletion. Caesar, understanding that disease could destroy even the victors, ordered the burning of camp remnants, disinfecting wells with fire and lime. These were the first steps towards what we today call sanitary discipline. However, the real battle for Caesar was just beginning, the political one. In Rome, whispers already circulated that his victory was not a triumph of the Republic, but a triumph of one man. Alesia made Caesar a legend, but also condemned him to the envy and fear of the Senate. Even his closest associate, legate Labienus, would later defect to Pompey's side. Thus, a victory won with blood became the seed of a future civil war. Meanwhile, the fate of the captured Gauls was decided quickly. According to various sources, Caesar released some allied tribes to show mercy, but sent most into slavery. Thousands of men and women were sold in the markets of Narbonese Gaul. A slave who survived Alesia was cheap, an emaciated but living trophy of the empire. Historians say it was the largest slave market of Caesar's entire campaign. And what about the legionaries? For their victory they received bread, wine, and the right to rest. Only then did they realize they were alive. Soldiers of the First Legion recorded in their chronicles that they ate their fill for the first time in many days. Their hands trembled, but not from fear, from the unfamiliar feeling of satiety. One centurion said that the taste of bread after Alesia was sweeter than honey. But even in this rest, Roman order was maintained. Every legionary was obliged to clean his armor, polish his weapons, check his straps and helmet. The metal plates of the lorica once again gleamed in the sun, as if nothing had happened. This moment of restoration was called reductio, a return to form, a symbol that even from hell one can emerge in formation. Caesar, observing his troops, understood Alesia was more than a victory. It was proof that Rome's strength lay not in the number of soldiers, but in their ability to obey. He wrote, "Neither gods nor fate save a coward, only order makes an army eternal." His words would later be carved in stone in Gaul, an inscription found by archaeologists in Lyon, believed to date back to this very campaign. From a military perspective, Alesia changed everything. It became the prototype of the total siege concept, where the enemy is destroyed not by a blow, but by the deprivation of hope. For the first time in history, a commander surrounded not only an army, but also himself, placing the fate of his troops on the brink of destruction. This principle would later be repeated by Napoleon at Ulm and Wellington at Waterloo. For the Gauls, the defeat marked the end of their dream of freedom. Their tribes fragmented, their elders swore allegiance to Rome. A Roman city, Alesia, with its baths and forum, would later rise on the site of Alesia. Archaeologists find inscriptions in Latin and Celtic in the layers from those years, a living testament to how one culture slowly absorbed another. But even in this subjugation, the shadow of Vercingetorix remained. His name was not uttered for a long time, but songs about him lived among the Gauls. Centuries later they would sing, "He stood against Rome and died, but did not bow his head." And perhaps that is why 19th century French archaeologists, upon finding the battle site, erected a statue of Vercingetorix there, facing Rome, as if he still stood guard over his land. Caesar, after Alesia, understood that an empire could be held not only by the sword, but also by the fear of the very idea of Rome. His army, having survived hunger and siege, became his personal guard, his instrument of destiny. In these surviving people there was something more than discipline. In them now lived a belief that Rome could not die as long as at least one legionary lived. When the troops left Alesia, the valley remained dead. No grass, no birds, no sounds, only the even scars of ramparts stretching to the horizon. Caesar rode through these places, stopped at the ruined gates, and gazed for a long time at the remnants of the city. Historians write that he then uttered, "Strength is not victory, strength is what remains after it." From Gaul, he sent envoys to Rome with news of the conquest, but there he was met not with applause, but with apprehension. The Senate feared that the commander who had subjugated a continent would now subjugate Rome itself. Alesia transformed Caesar from a general into a threat. The victory won with blood became the beginning of a new war, internal, inevitable. Meanwhile, the ashes of Alesia cooled. Roman engineers returned to erect a colony on the site of the destroyed fortress. First, temples to Jupiter and Mars, then baths, roads, and amphitheater. A new city grew on the bones of the fallen, as a symbol that an empire builds even on ruins, and yet the memory of that siege lived on. In the folk legends of Gaul, Caesar became a demon who came with fire and iron, and Vercingetorix, the last hero who dared to say no. Thus two truths, Roman and Gallic, were forever intertwined, in the land where every drop of rain still falls on the bones of those who stood at Alesia.